could, in view of all these elements, who could compare himself to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, humanly speaking, he is an exception to the rule. He is an exception in history. That is to say, that a warlord can have a form of incomprehensible indulgence with regard to an order that has been given formally and that has not been respected. And normally, in fact, in all armies in the world, people who have not complied with the order are liable to the death penalty, because not complying with the commander's order is considered high treason, and it actually exists in all the armies of the world. It is not because there are armies that present themselves as armies in the service of democracy and peace in the world that the notion of high treason, when a soldier does not respect the order of the command, of the high command, is not punishable by a certain number of I would say of punishments of more or less dramatic consequences for the soldier, and there, in reality, this is what the verse is talking about. It is that in the face of high treason, the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was able to show an incomprehensible indulgence. And Allah reminds us that, in fact, this indulgence was possible thanks to this raHma, which is this unconditional love, which is actually the greatest test for us. That is to say, how can I do, even when I am in my strictest right, how can I perform an act of unconditional love? Oh, the more so in situations that are dramatic, serious. There, the situation was serious, because a warlord, normally, who does not punish people who are in a form of high treason, can jeopardize the entire army. That is to say, it can jeopardize everything that serves to defend a country, a people, a community, etc. And so the situation is serious, and normally in serious situations you need a form of action that corresponds to the seriousness of the situation. And that's not what happened at all. And that's why Allah is following.
وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَظًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ.
That is, if you had been intransigent in a form of firmness of heart, hardness of heart regarding the punishment to apply, regardless of the consideration for those archers who have weakened, who have faltered, who have been in a form of weakness.
لَنْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكِ.
And here, what we have seen in the translations is that the translators, they translate
لَنْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكِ
as they would have defected. And in reality, that's not what the word means at all. In fact, if the Prophet had not behaved in this incomprehensible way of gentleness, indulgence, haughtiness towards his beings, that is to say, they would have collapsed. By what? Because of the heaviness of the load. And let's not forget that these are people who left Mecca, and for some of them, they left everything there. For some, they left their wives and children. For others, they have left their trade, all of their trades. These are people who sacrificed everything for the Prophet. So you imagine a leader at the slightest opportunity of weakness, of people who have sacrificed everything for him to follow him. In the end, there was nothing to indicate, probably from a rational point of view, that this man was going to lead them to something bigger, more consistent, more important up here than what he could already experience in Mecca. There was no clue in reality for the people who left Mecca and came to Medina and followed the Prophet, that finally the future was going to be brighter. It was rather the opposite that was, I would say, manifest. And in fact, in front of these people, if the Prophet had not had this high capacity for indulgence, of course he would have collapsed, like a wall that can crumble and collapse out of weakness. And it's the same term, in fact. That's what it means. It's shaking, collapsing through weakness, through lack of strength.
لَنْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكِ.
And to the contrary, actually.
فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ.
So,
فَعَفُوا.
It's a form of grace, you see, as you, I don't know if it still exists, but as presidents or monarchs can show grace. The presidential pardon, the royal pardon, is when grace, if you will, is in the sense of
عَفُوا.
It is the cancellation of the legal consequences of a given action. Normally, the legal consequence for these archers is that they are at least imprisoned, at most probably, given the rules, let's say, that were in force at the time, probably punishable by death. And there, in fact, Allah asked the Prophet to do the
عَفُوا.
is cancelling the consequences that should normally apply. And it's not over. It's not just
عَفُوا.
and to do the
istighfar
for them.
istighfar,
is taking actions to attract the divine
غفران,
people. To take action to ensure that Allah covers those men who have weakened, who have not complied with His command, who have disobeyed, who have failed in their duty to do istighfar for. And it's not over. This is where we see the greatness and the marvelous side, the miraculous side of what the Quran can offer. Allah does not end.
وشاورهم في الأمر.
And these same people, in fact, you will continue to consult with them. I think you have all experienced in some form of interpersonal relationship with people, when there are people who are failing in their duty. What emanates from men? Is it a form of what? Intransigence, radicalism, in the application of legal rules? And probably there are people among us who have experienced this form of
غليظ القلب.
this hardness of heart that prevents us from what? To act
رحمة.
in front of beings who are,
رحمنك.
in essence, basic.
وشاورهم في الأمر.
So continue to consult them. Weakness, the failure of duty, does not cancel the greatness of these beings, does not cancel the sacrifice they may have made, does not cancel the degree of realization that was there. So there is already in this a manifestation of this prophetic figure, once again, which according to some is an exception in human history. An exception in several ways. And it reminds me of a saying of Lamartine, at least in what has been attributed to him. Who said that, in fact, the criteria for evaluation, for considering the greatness of a man, are the smallness of the means, the greatness of the work, and the greatness of the faith. 3 elements. The more rudimentary the means, but the greater the consequences, the greater the work, the more it allows us to identify the greatness of a man. The greater the size of the fate, despite the smallness of the means of departure, that is to say, the more there is a gap between these two, the greater the person, in fact, can be considered as great. And in fact, he ends up saying, who could, in view of all these elements, who could compare himself to
Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
Humanly speaking, he is an exception to the rule. He is an exception in history. And this is the miracle in reality. The miracle is not incapable of producing a text that is similar to the Quran. No. The miracle is in the Quran's ability to forge, to shape, to structure, to influence, to impact, to impregnate beings, so that they are able to produce things that are out of the ordinary. This is the miracle, the ability, in fact, to be able to behave incomprehensibly, at the limit of humanity. And once again, the human being is what is interesting, and what gives hope, is that the human, in fact, he has this high capacity to behave in a way that is just incomprehensible. And he also has this ability to behave in a way that is the opposite, in a form of mediocrity, of total absence of
رحمة.
total absence of gentleness.
اللين. فبما رحمة من الله لنت لهم.
This episode, in fact, it is, once again, he reveals the greatness of the prophetic figure.
صلى الله عليه وسلم.
And by the way, the end of the verse is very eloquent in this regard.
فإذا عزمت فتوكل على الله إن الله يحب المتوكلين.
So once you have, after consulting with them, and you have acted, you have decided something.
فتوكل على الله.
And we have seen in Tawakkul, in reality, it is the fact of taking Allah as a support, as a maintenance, and as an over-support. But Allah, in fact, intervenes at all levels. He is the one who supports us so that we do not collapse, as the wall could collapse. As the archers who disobeyed the order could have collapsed.
لانفضوا من حولك.
Like a house of cards that collapses. That support, as a support that allows the edifice, the human structure to remain standing, working, despite adversity, despite difficulty, despite probably an apparent deprivation of something. Then it's the maintenance. It is because Allah takes us by the hand. Because at some point we need to be taken by the hand in the face of difficulty, not knowing where to go. Do I go to the right? I go to the left. I go in front. I go behind. And over support is because Allah is sublime. He will pull us up. And
Tawakkul
is really that. It's how to operate a form of letting go, of, how can we say that? Of openness, of availability to the divine support, maintenance, and over-support. Because in the end, when you are His instrument, that is to say, in fact, to prevent or forbid ourselves from making catastrophic projections, anticipating disasters and catastrophic scenarios. How many of us have made disaster scenarios every time? We are considering worst-case scenarios, and the Tawakkul teaches us that. And finally, this is how the verse is closed.
وتوكل على الله إن الله يحب المتوكلين.
In fact, this verse, either we are not going to translate it. Allah loves the
متوكلين.
That is, those who take Allah as their support, maintenance, over-support. But in another sense, it is Allah who makes
المتوكلين.
seeds of love in the world. Seeds of love in the world. Try to put yourself in the shoes of these archers. Let's look at the prophetic behavior. How must it have been their love for the Prophet faced with a behavior that is just unbelievable? How does love grow in the face of a behavior that is just
رحمانك.
that surpasses all understanding, and that is of a gentleness, of a
لين رحمانك.
indulgence, availability, of a miraculous grace and the ability to effectively overcome? In reality, it is a real gift for the one who can benefit from it. It is a real gift for those who can, I would say, appropriate it, fill themselves with it, and be satisfied with it. So, again, I would say, in opposition to what could be expected of him, once again the prophetic figure surprised, literally the human understanding. It is because things always take place in the place that is most opportune, that is most conducive to actually being able to produce the desired effect in the divine plan, in the divine will, and in which sometimes exceeds understanding. And there what we see, the mound where there are people who climb on it. This is the famous mound on which the archers were perched, were positioned, who had received the formal, radical, and definitive order from the Prophet ﷺ not to move under any circumstance. And it is how to absorb the dualities that exist within us, probably sometimes the forms of tension, of opposition, of internal contradiction, so that it becomes one. And actually that verse, it refers to this high attitude that has never been seen in human history.